and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, Julia Gillard achieves what Kevin Rudd couldn't, but how does her health deals with the states stack up? The biggest casualty in the WikiLeaks war? Did Julian Assange hang his source out to dry? And why Bono is backing a controversial song about killing Afrikaners. Our panel tonight, Sue Cato from Cato Counsel, Joe Hildebrand from the Daily Telegraph, and author and blogger and journalist Antony Loewenstein. Well, Julia Gillard has managed to pull off a policy reform where her predecessor failed, striking a national health deal with all the states and territories. Under the revamped plan, the federal government will provide 50% of new health funding, but the premiers won't have to hand over their GST revenue. The Prime Minister says the package will create one unified system without the added bureaucracy.
Walked out of the room having ensured we've got one national agreement, transparency, proper funding, local control, new investments in primary care and less bureaucracy. For people around the country, this does mean more money, more beds, less waiting time, more access to the health care that they want now and into the future.
Conservative state governments may well be on board, but not the federal coalition. Opposition leader Tony Abbott called it the biggest surrender since Singapore, and Shadow Health Minister Peter Dutton says it won't last.
It was obviously the case that there was a stalemate last night, and that instead of coming out to say that no deal had been reached, Julia Gillard decided to come out to say that a heads of agreement had been arrived at, and it's starting to unravel already. It will be 10 full years before the full money starts to flow from the time that Kevin Rudd first made his infamous promise to fix public hospitals or take them over.
For the most part, the health lobby has welcomed the deal, but President of the Australian Medical Association, Dr Andrew Pesce, says it will all come down to whether the states are willing to cede control to hospitals.
Funding agreement is necessary but not sufficient to deliver health reform. The real reforms will come from the other parts of the agreement which were struck earlier in the initial one and which have not been changed by this one. And I presume and assume that the premiers will honour their obligations under the previous deal to devolve decision-making to the local hospital networks to make sure that they put in place the legislative changes that are required to really make the decisions and deliver on-the-ground service reform, which is what the patient going to the hospital will see will improve their services.
So what does this health deal mean for the government and for voters? Well, to break it down, we're now joined by the ABC's Latika Burke in Canberra. And Latika, we heard last time that this deal was meant to be historic, the last COAG health reform package. That didn't end up too well. What's the difference this time?
Well, I suppose the difference is, Steve, that every single Premier and state or territory leader has signed on, whereas with the last agreement, Colin Barnett didn't. And eventually that was what stymied that deal. Now, Colin Barnett always said he would support Kevin Rudd's deal as long as it didn't involve him having to hand back his GST revenue. So, in principle, he supported much of what Julia Gillard last night proposed as her major achievement, and that is the efficient pricing for medical procedures, that is the local hospital networks, which I might add, Tony Abbott and Peter Dutton in the opposition support too. So their opposition to this plan today is very interesting.
And Latika, we could see some opposition coming from the man people think will be the next Premier of New South Wales, Barry O'Farrell. He hasn't given any guarantee that he'll sign on to this deal.
No, that's right, but Barry O'Farrell is about to embark on a campaign for an election he's very likely to win. So why would he bother giving Julia Gillard a win right now when he could have his own authority in a couple of months? But having said that, New South Wales, and this is one of the ironic things, Kevin Rudd's deal was actually rolled out or partly rolled out in New South Wales under Christina Keneally. So local hospital networks are ready to go there from July 1. And as Christina Keneally said last night at the COAG press conference, New South Wales has already rolled out many of those beds promised in the deal struck last April. So Barry O'Farrell would have to unwind some of those reforms, which might be more difficult than seeing them through.
Latika, Professor John Dwyer was on Radio National Breakfast this morning and he was saying this is health funding reform, it's not health system reform. Now, Julia Gillard said she's going to deliver on reform this year. How is this going to play into her whole so-called reform agenda?
Yeah, well, there's a lot on Julia Gillard's plate, as everyone has been saying. Not only does she have to price carbon, which to date no leader has been able to do, and two have partly lost their leadership because of it, she's also got to deal with the mining tax and all these other growing concerns. Now, she's put to bed this initial agreement, but Steve, mental health is still there, and that is a huge problem. Mike Rann, the South Australian Premier, successfully sought another COAG meeting to deal specifically with mental health, so that's going to come up. And also later in the year, in December, we're going to see the Productivity Commission report on aged care, which is another huge burden on the system. And you're right that this is really hospital reform as opposed to an overarching health system reform. And all those things interact. And a lot of the burden on hospitals and a way of reforming hospitals is to actually deal with the entire health sector, particularly preventive health.
Latika, thanks for that, and we'll see you on the drum tomorrow night.
Thanks, Steve.
Joe, is this a win for Julia Gillard?
I struggle to see how it is, really, I've got to say. I think it's a pretty weak sort of set of reforms. I think it'll be very difficult for her to explain to punters how the system has actually changed. You don't have a dominant health provider. The states are still able to pass the buck to the Commonwealth to the states. When Kevin Rudd announced this in 2007, I think it was meant to be done by 2009, so it's also 2 years late. He said that he wanted the buck to stop with the federal government if the states did not lift their game. During those 2 years that he was meant to implement it, they actually had a Labor government federally. You had a Labor government in every single state and territory. It defies belief that somehow still nothing managed to be done. Like, you almost have to work very hard to create that sort of inertia. The same thing happened with water, of course, as well. Like, these great windows of opportunity were missed. And I think it's just indicative that, I mean, if you put people in a room together for 8 hours, especially if it's COAG, I mean, that's a form of torture. That's like rendition. They'll come out at the end of that, they'll say anything. They'll start naming names, So instead they've come out with this heads of agreement. It's not even binding. The state's still to get control over how the funding is dispersed and distributed down the line to hospital networks, which, may end up just being another word for area health services, but just a few more of them just chopped in half. And I think, then you might start to see the same old inefficiencies there. We've got state oppositions all over the place, particularly the Libs, who want to implement smaller hospital boards, smaller hospital networks. Anyway, it's just a mess. And if she can sell this one, she really should be out there with a fridge at Eskimo Land.
Sue, what's your response to what Joe Hildebrand sees as an 8-hour torture session at COAG?
I was going to say 8 hours. He's seen nothing. 8 hours is just the warm-up. That's normally morning tea for these guys. And can I just say, on your Tony returning to military themes, they've been working so well for him, talking about policy. Yes. Thanks, Tony. But, it's really interesting. I think as the wider electorate, whether you talk about the states or the federal, I think people are just about sick of these guys going around in circles. And I think there's probably a desire on various people that they wish they would just actually sort it out. I've got to say, while I want an outcome, a little cynical that we're spending a lot of money all over the place, and, reading what each one of the premiers has said is we're getting $300 million more. Ted Baillieu is saying they're getting more. Mike Rann say they're getting more money. So we've got a solution. How is it actually working? And, Joe, you're talking about the fact of what it doesn't hold. Yeah. The question is, what the hell does it actually deliver? It's pretty shallow. But, it's interesting to me, though, is Barry O'Farrell, who's about to inherit a government, being so negative. Barry's got to start talking about what he will do and what his health policy is and what they can deliver rather than ripping other people's positions down, I would have thought. Antony, your response to this announcement, this deal?
I think one of the things that always is ignored in this debate is the issue between public and private. In many ways, of course, the question surely should be that the majority of Australians rely on public service. Obviously, there's a private element as well, which has been there in the Howard government, accelerated that over the last 10 years before the Labor government came in. But it seems to me that there's often an ignoring about where the money actually is going. Is there an increasing reliance on private sector health services, which to me I think is a problem because many people can't afford it, won't be able to afford it? And is there an increasing reliance by Labor, which is the same what the Liberals want to do, in forcing many more people into the private health system? That to me is avoidable if both state and federal decide to invest far more in public services, which in many Western countries they're increasingly doing less and less of. And those questions I think are really talked about.
Joe, is this real reform? Because you know, what the critical people in the areas are saying is we need to focus more on, you know, preventing chronic disease, to stop people using the hospital system, not just to keep funding the hospital system.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think one of the most important things is that Australians sort of see their local emergency ward as a kind of 7-Eleven. It's a place that's open all night and will fix them up for whatever they need. And that mentality's absolutely got to stop. On weekends, it's their worst time because everyone's going out getting blotto, they're glassing each other, they're falling downstairs, they're falling off bar stools, and that's absolutely true. And it stops people with legitimate illnesses, people with horrible toothaches or old ladies who've fallen down. Stops them getting treatment because you've got these drunken idiots in there, so that's got to stop as well. But I'll tell you what, the best way the federals and the states could reform hospitals is to follow the exact model that they use at St Vincent's Hospital in the middle of town in Sydney, and that is where you have one organisation that runs both the public and the private hospital. It's funded by the public, and what happens is every time someone goes to the private hospital, the Sisters of Charity, they're very sneaky, very shrewd businesswomen. They just wheel them across to the private. If they've got private health insurance, they just wheel them across to the private hospital. They bill the Commonwealth Government or the private healthcare provider for the full amount of their care, the full cost of their care, whereas with the other ones, the public hospitals have to just chuck them into a public bed where under the Howard reforms, they only get a tiny fraction of what it actually costs, which is an absolute criminal act of underfunding. And so all that they had to do was actually rope around a thing and say this is technically a private hospital, and they go cha-ching, and the private healthcare providers would be forced to pay for it.
Well, moving on to other issues now, and Labor is a step closer to pushing the flood levy through Parliament after winning the support of Family First Senator Steve Fielding. But independent MP Tony Windsor says he's leaning the other way. He'd prefer the reconstruction effort to be funded by extending the budget deficit. The Business Council isn't keen on a levy either, although it wants the budget back in surplus. It's flagged the idea of cuts to disability pensions and also foreign aid. And as everyone argued over the levy today, Queensland Premier Anna Bligh stopped short of criticising the speed of the federal government's flood payments.
My main concern about the federal government's funding is that Queensland gets what it's entitled to under the National Disaster Relief Arrangements. Frankly, the sooner we've got certainty about how they're going to fund that, the better it will be. But ultimately, the federal government are required to make these payments to Queensland. If the flood levy doesn't get through, then they'll have to go back to the drawing board, but I hope we don't see that happen.
So let's go back to the Business Council's comments today. They represent the CEOs of some of the top 100 companies in the country. Is it a bad look for them to be criticising people on disability pensions and suggesting that, you know, there should be reform in this area?
I'm actually going to pinch a line from Latika when she describes something as an interesting decision. The president of the BCA, Graham Bradley, is a highly respected business person and known for his common good